We are live on Facebook. Welcome everyone to today's Sihasin Hour as part of Native American Heritage Month. We're hosting a series of discussions highlighting critical issues in Indian country, but particularly focused on Navajo or Hopi. And with us today, we have Jolene Holgate from Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives with us to share some information about that issue, really focusing on the MMIW issue as it relates to Navajo people and extending beyond women and girls as well to all of our Diné relatives. But briefly, I'll introduce myself. She'e Ethel Branchian Chef, Beef Patwotni Nishle, Nakai Basha Change, Sinajane Desha Che, Don Nakai Desha Nala, Sesizi Denasha. And I'm speaking to you from the sacred lands of the Diné people, as well as 16 other indigenous nations here at the base of Delegate, as you can see in the background. It's one of the 4 sacred mountains for the Diné people. And so I'm the executive director of Ye Ha'almido, which does business as Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. And Jolene, we are so happy to have you here with us. And we will also have Honorable Delegate Crotty joining us soon. And so Jolene, if you want to introduce yourself to the audience, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, She'e Jolene Holgate in Shia. Gazalana in Shling Delog at Diné Ebashichin, Hushkan, Hetzoha de Shachedo, Twitchini Dashanella, Shantko Hadin Asinasha. I am currently in so-called Albuquerque, which is Tiwa territory, the ancestral homelands of our Pueblo relatives. And I am a member of the Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives Task Force. The other hat I wear is I am the Training and Education Director at the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women here in Albuquerque. A lot of our work parallels supporting survivors, centering the voices of families, and that's just a little bit about me. I'm originally from Shantu, Arizona, so I am a transplant here to New Mexico, and very happy to be here today.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jolene, for your introduction. You're not really a transplant, that's Navajo territory. You know, we have our 4 sacred rivers bounding us, including, of course, the Rio Grande on the eastern side. So you're still in Diné territory. Well, thanks again for joining us. And I'm wondering if you can just share with our viewers, you know, what is this concept of MMIDR, Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives, and how did this come about? I'm sure lots of people have heard of the MMIW or MMIWG acronym. If you could just familiarize our viewers with MMDR.
Sure. MMDR is a collective of community members, families affected by the missing and murdered crisis, as well as folks from varying programs and backgrounds that are taking a multidisciplinary approach to the missing and murdered crisis on the Navajo Nation. Our collective was established in March 2019, and we felt that there was a need. The work really originated with under the leadership of Delegate Crotty with the Sexual Assault Prevention Subcommittee, which was developed in response to the tragedy of losing our baby girl, Ashlyn Mike. And we realized that these intersections of domestic violence and sexual violence really played a key role into the missing and murdered crisis on the Navajo Nation. Understanding that the MMIW movement really originated with our northern relatives in Canada in the 1970s and started to spread throughout North America and reached our areas, I think was great. It was amazing. And it really started conversations within our own communities. It took a lot of convincing of our own Navajo Nation public safety, our own tribal leadership, to really see what the scope of the issue. I think at times we get so dependent on having and needing actual data to prove that there is an issue. But when we don't have that data or anyone collecting it, that doesn't mean that it's not happening. So this collective originally was established to develop a data institute to start looking at those cases, but also really having a chance for us to take a self-determined way of how we're addressing the missing and murdered crisis, but also supporting one another. Of course, the spirit of our task force comes from supporting our families who have been affected by the missing and murdered crisis. The common thread that we see a lot is a lot of folks have someone that has gone missing or who has been murdered. And when we engage into these conversations, the space is created for us to come together to think about ways not only to support the work, but how do we support one another? How do we start engaging in healing conversations and really validating these stories and truths that the families have been amplifying. So that's a little bit about who we are, what we do, and how we originated and how we came to be.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we are honored to have Delegate Crotty with us at this time. Delegate Crotty, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be wonderful. And then if you want to add anything to what Jolene has mentioned in terms of the origins of the MMDR, that would be wonderful.
So thank you, Yate. Anotso so kia ani neshle do bilagana bashischin, deschini de shade do bilagana de shanale, amber kinas bakradi yanishet tohatsoi bant nasha. So I come from the foothills of the Chushka Mountain. I want to thank Navajo Hopi families for inviting us and creating this space now with the nonprofit and the work that we want to do, because I think that's always the big disparity is how can the Navajo Nation government be nimble and flexible to meet the needs of the people? And it really is by partnering and working with our local nonprofits, especially when they're Navajo led and the team comes from the community and want to provide those solutions. I think other areas why you see in recent times, and some folks think, well, this is very recent to talk about our missing and murdered. And what Jolene may have mentioned is that this is a crisis from contact. We've been targeted, we've been displaced, and we've been dehumanized. And so our experience then is also dehumanized. And so not only do we disappear in the spaces that were placed here for us, we've also disappeared in urban areas where we've been relocated, and we're then also displaced from the data and not telling our story. And so as we heard of the tragedies of not what is happening to our children, we also know then that wasn't reflective in our data. So we had to gather and collect the stories and then use those stories in a way and develop kind of this methodology where we could start inputting that information into the data. So we still know at this time and date, not all of our relatives are on any of these federal databases, but as a group and as MMDR, we've opened it to be so inclusive, survivor-centered family wraparound services that I don't think that could be replicated by our federal partners because they don't have the teaching and the groundwork that we have. And so what our goal is just to keep them accountable to the type of services that they're able to provide, the protection, the restoration, and then for the community and for the families to come together and provide that holistic framework. So I just wanted to add on a little bit more in terms of how we started, what we've learned and where we want to go for the next 4, 15, 20 years, because what we want to do is heal from this. And so our children can heal, and so that we could break those bonds and chains of this intergenerational trauma and no longer normalize the violence, no longer normalize when someone's missing in our home, and no longer be silent on the issue. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I was just going back to the 2018 report that was issued by the Urban Indian Health Institute. And, one thing that you said that struck me was, the lack of data and, what is actually showing up in the federal database. And it was really striking because in that report, they identified that there were 116 cases of MMIWG reported in 2016 in the DOJ database. But through other means, like what you're talking about, like talking to people in the communities and self-reporting, they had identified 5,712 of these cases. So, I mean, it's such a small percentage of the actual cases that are showing up in these databases. That's so interesting. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about like what you're seeing on Navajo, like the disparities maybe between what's showing up in official reporting systems versus what you guys are finding? And I know like it might just be anecdotal at this point as you guys are assembling your data in your institute.
So I'm going to take the jab first because this is an area that we've really drilled down in terms of. So first, I want to say that Navajo Nation, we need our own data institute. We need to have and assert our sovereignty over data that's available in all of these federal databases, as they do not talk to one another. And so the days of saying, well, they don't talk to one another, so therefore we can't provide you information, that's where then we need to request that information and hire and build up systems here on Navajo to tell that story. And that's what we saw through Sovereign Bodies Institute and the report that you referred to. They were able then to go through all of the different data points and comb through and do more work to figure out if and identify who could possibly have a tribal affiliation in how the different data was collected. And so why that is so important is so that as Navajo Nation, we can create solutions based on what we see in the data, understand what are the gaps and the opportunities. How can we incorporate the Navajo wellness model? And that will inherently then put in a system where we're tracking cases and being accountable to the whole system. So now I feel like before starting this, I always thought justice was given through the criminal justice system. And now I know that's not the case. And so the way that I look at these issues is how can we provide healing? And what we want to do then is when we have access to our own data, when we're able to analyze it, and we're able to reflect like in that Sihasin moment, then we could be accountable in terms of our missing relatives. We should know where our children are at. If they're in the system, we should know where they're at. We should know when, our ICWA cases, we should have an idea. And we should also as a nation, because of our duty and relationship to one another, is make sure that we're doing okay when we're off, when we've had to go to the urban areas or international. And whether that's for work, for going to school, that is the prime duty of why we're placed here in our kinship values. And so that's going to take a lot of coordination. That's going to take a lot of investment, but that's how valuable we are. Wouldn't we want our stories to be told? Wouldn't we want to share? Wouldn't we want our communities to come together and say, this person is, your relative is missing, so your relative is my relative, and I'm going to keep my eyes out for them. And that's what we want to do, is build up community, and we want our government and a data system to reflect that. And so when we're in these tribal consultations, I don't think the federal government can do it, nor the state. It has to be the nation. And we have individuals who are trained in epidemiology, we have public health experts, we have traditional knowledge holders, we have grandma, we have grandpa. And so we still have the system in play to develop that. And so as we look at what's going on with missing and murdered, we'll also can see how that lends to intimate partner violence, but also some of the benefits. What are some of the prevention work that we could do to bring back that resiliency, to bring back and connect those families together? So thank you for that question. I'm very passionate about that. And I really do believe that we have the solutions and we just need that investment and that continued, we need the people to demand it from their leaders, and we need leaders who are willing to do the work and implement and maintain those types of systems.
Great. Jolene, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think along with like having ownership for, over our data, it's also, I think, a lot about accountability. I think it's also factoring into ways that we're thinking about healing. And a part of that healing is, I think, learning and unlearning ways that have consistently kind of pigeonholed a lot of how we do things on the Navajo Nation. I also agree that these solutions aren't always going to be, a top-down approach, but we have many community groups that are coming together, that are organizing, who are making it a priority to start developing these solutions. And it's usually a collective of passionate folks who are volunteering their time and their love to help families. MMDR, we are an all-volunteer group. We are not a nonprofit yet, but we are very small, but we're very proud and we're very strong. And that's how we are able to push a lot of these initiatives forward. And I think along with that, even when we do like debriefings, we have internal conversations about what do we want for the future. We think about, as we engage in this work, like what does a safe community look like? If we were to go into community and ask, for you, what is a safe community? These are the questions that we should be asking, as well as elevating to make sure that we're always supporting and centering the voices of families. So along with that is having ownership over our stories, over our data, and just really having a very intentional way of how we address the missing and murdered crisis. Yeah, and everything that Delegate Crotty said.
Great, thanks so much, Jolene. I mean, how bad is the missing and murdered Diné relatives issue? And is there a way to kind of, like, how bad is that on Navajo Nation? And then how bad is that off reservation? Do we have a sense for that at this time? Do we have any stats at this time?
We don't have exact data. The information that we collect is what we're able to have access to through FBI reports, through law enforcement. The Navajo Nation currently does not have a crime analyst, so the data that they give to us is like very raw. But we also lean on organizations like Sovereign Bodies Institute, as well as our sister organization, Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, who have been collecting this information, cases back to the 1950s here on the Navajo Nation. If we were to give a very rough estimate of what that looks like on the Navajo Nation, there are about, I want to say about 70% of our missing persons cases are male relatives, but also, in addition to that, 30% of cases are missing women. But if we were to look at the issue of violence, gender-based violence, of course, is being perpetrated against our women, our transgender and queer relatives that are also targeted when it comes to the missing and murdered crisis. So yeah, so that's kind of what it looks like on the Navajo Nation right now. And we're continuing to collect those stories, and families are able to share a lot of their experiences with us. So we can't give like an actual number of what that looks like, but we do rely on our partners to help illustrate that picture. And the scope of the issue, I know a lot of times isn't really illustrated as to like why it happens. There's so many reasons. Things that intersect with this crisis are like domestic violence, sexual violence, and just the lack of a social system that is not able to support our relatives who are in need healing from generational and intergenerational trauma, or even historical trauma. We carry that historical trauma in our DNA, in our bodies, and having these conversations and holding space for that is one of the solutions that we're looking at. One question we get a lot is, you know, if there's a higher percentage of male relatives, like why is that happening? We can't say for sure, but we know that in doing some of the direct work with families, a lot of it really has to do with unaddressed traumas, maybe utilizing, you know, drugs and alcohol as a means of coping mechanisms. Maybe they don't have a strong support system at home. And I think that's the unlearning, right, that we need to think about when our relatives go missing. It's really important that we are very cautious of not victim blaming or victim shaming. Some of the stereotypes and stigmas we hear out there is like, oh, they're just going out drinking. Oh, they want to go missing. At the very end of the day, they're missing. That is a human being out there that is alone, that doesn't have a support system. And we're just looking at ways to understand how we can create better support systems for our community to address this.
Interesting. Did you want to add it?
And I would add, if I may, sorry. What's important to understand about what's happening with the crisis of our missing and murdered Diné relatives is to understand the intersections of other like interpersonal violence. And some of these acute cases have, and when I say acute, this means long-term under very suspicious circumstances where the family will say, I know my relative was in an abusive relationship and the last person that was seen with her was their abusive partner. And they may have been interviewed and let go. And so our concern is then in this interview process, or how we look at maybe like habitual offenders, we need to start connecting the dots to say, just like how we learned about like strangulation that gets you at a higher rate of fatality in some of these really violent situations, then we need to talk about what happened prior to our relative being missing, and to understand then how we have to coordinate with all of our direct providers to first understand some of the red flags and then provide support so that we can decrease the amount of our relatives. And so when we talk about like what is the impact, not only is that relative missing, but that's a mom. So her kids are grieving for her to come back. Her parents are grieving for her to come back. It spirals, and it also can re-traumatize the family with the lack of support and dedication. And so I think in terms of how we deal with this, those are the considerations on why we want to amplify what's happening in our communities, and Navajo Nation have a strong response, because it's the next layer of trauma. And so I think in terms of that's how we see it. And some folks will say, well, there's only a few or a handful of cases. But what Miski and her all-volunteer team with Navajo Nation Missing Persons Update has been able to identify a whole poster board full of individuals. And through their efforts, they've been able to identify, I don't know, nearly 50 relatives who have been missing. And as we talk to more of our veterans, we find out some of their comrades who have been what they call lost to the streets, but really they're not accountable. Nobody knows what happened to these individuals. And so that causes pain and hurt from their parents, their children, and their relatives who are still looking for them.
Thanks for sharing that. And it seems like, I mean, you know, there's a nexus here with when we talk about of the data that we do have, there's a disproportionate occurrence of missing and murdered male relatives. And I just think, you know, about the housing crisis on Navajo Nation. And, you know, traditionally property is passed, where matrilineal society is passed woman to woman. And so there are a lot of homeless men, Navajo men. And there's a lot of couch surfing that happens. And that leads to lots of different problems, but it seems like, you know, I wonder if it's those same men who are, you know, without a home really, that end up going missing because, like, you know, they're looking for shelter essentially, and happen along the way if they're not able to find that shelter. Have you guys seen any trends with respect to homelessness among our men?
So I don't want to overstep, but we hosted prior to COVID a specific forum on the Navajo male experience when it comes to our missing and murdered. And I want to say it was hard to organize that event because there was not a lot of direct services that really focus in on the Navajo male experience. But when we talk with families who now are willing at least to disclose, there is this ebb and flow of their children who have found themselves unsheltered because they're dealing with their trauma, whether it's drugs or with alcohol abuse. And so, you know, they find themselves in a situation unsheltered, you know, on the streets. And what they have found, and when they report them missing, is they have this ebb and flow in saying, my son may go out, but he comes back home. And when a time, they kind of know that internally, like a time will pass, and then that's when the family gets concerned, and they usually go to social media. So Facebook plays a big part of this, cell phone use plays a big part of this, and then they use those tools to try to connect and get updates. And when they stop responding, that's when the family knows something has happened, because although their loved one was unsheltered, dealing with their trauma, they would always contact them via social media or the phone. And so that usually is a big red flag for families. And we do have some of our relatives then who are on the missing list because they have not contacted their family. They've gone dark on social media. And our hope is that working with some of our urban Indian partners is that we have better collaboration when it comes to our unsheltered relatives. And if they're being targeted, and we saw this in Albuquerque when they were unsheltered and being targeted and murdered, then what is the system and what is the Navajo Nation solution to that? And that could be through, if they want, you know, well-being, if they want to go through a treatment program, if they need to reconnect with their family, if they need those skills to overcome their trauma. And so since this is so prevalent, those are some of the solutions that we're looking at not just a trickle effect. I mean, we need a huge investment because there's no indication right now that our missing are slowing down. Matter of fact, we're finding out some of these cases are getting violent, more violent, as we understand what's happening when we're able to find either someone who was murdered or now someone who we still don't know what has happened to them.
I was looking at the police department, Navajo Police Department's final organization assessment, and they reference a lot of data, but I wasn't able to identify what the homicide rate is for Navajo women in that report. But in that 2018 report, they mentioned, sorry, I have a slight cold, that they identified, CDC identified murder as a third leading cause of death among Native women. Do we have a sense with respect to Navajo women?
Thank you. I'm also having a minor cold or allergies or whatnot, so get yourself a cough drop. But with Jolene, and I want to give some time to Jolene, we are pulling together, and this is where data is really helpful. I've made an official request to Navajo Nation Department of Police Department and their data team to tease out from our homicide rates between women and men. We also need to understand, our transgendered or LGBTQ community. But while we're building up our data system, so at this point, I don't have the answer right now, but we want to include that and have a more of an annual snapshot of what's happening when it comes to violence of women and children. So again, that we know if these protective factors or our investment or a lack of investment is decreasing, or are we slowly going back in that incline? And for murder and homicide, we've been consistently at these very high numbers per capita.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jolene. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. We don't know for sure what the numbers are, but I think it's okay to say that a lot of the gender-based violence that's happening on the Navajo Nation is directly targeting Navajo women, our children, our transgender and queer relatives. And I think if we talk to folks like our victim advocates, they work directly with survivors of violence, and a large percentage of them are women and children. I think that's one way we can acknowledge that this really is an issue that affects our women. And also just the behavior of what had taken place on council floor, where we had a woman leader share their story and be very vulnerable, and then to have a male colleague come and invalidate their experience, to dehumanize and denigrate their humanity in such a public way, I think is a clear example of what gender-based violence looks like on the Navajo Nation. One thing that I think, along with addressing how we help and support our male relatives through their healing, is also having conversations through communities about how we involve men and hold men accountable that are perpetrating these violences. Within our internal task force, we have a couple of our brothers who are starting these conversations. They are finding ways to navigate to bring this to the forefront, and I think that's really important that we also acknowledge, that we name as we start to address the violences that are happening. So yeah, that's something that I wanted to add.
Yeah. And on that point, and one statistic that Delegate Crotty often refers to is the fact that our homicide rate on Navajo is 4 times the national average. And it's much higher than some more urban areas. I don't know if you guys want to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. I want to shed light on that specific data point, because we need to unpackage on what's happening and the type of violence. What we see across Indian country is, so first we need the Violence Against Women Act to be passed at a federal level. And what we need to do here on Navajo is to understand the dynamic of what's happening and what's leading these horrific cases of homicide here on the nation, and the system then that has to address these homicides, and as homicide and murder and violence occur, then what is our response in terms of providing victim services, survivor services, and for those families who are trying to heal after brutally losing those individuals. So these are open wounds here that we see, and it's creating space to have those conversations, creating space for survivors to tell their stories and to heal with one another. And that parallels to the experience of our missing and murdered, because oftentimes when there's an initial homicide that's identified, there's nowhere in the report, or rarely in the report, that will identify that this person was either missing, reported missing, had not been seen in a few days. And that's the information that would be helpful as we do some of our advocacy work in making sure that how we can respond to our missing and murdered Diné relatives in a, again, always this very inclusive way, because what we found were some of the families who were in crisis looking for their missing mother, then their children were in crisis, and then we had a second generation who was missing from the home. So imagine the impact of that family and what that looks like. And ultimately, we found mom. She was taken violently from us. And what does that mean then when we have individuals who may be habitual offenders, but we have no place or no mechanism to really prosecute or to make sure that we're keeping our community safe? So that goes back to who's in our community, who's perpetuating the violence. And if they have all of these little microaggressions and then scaling up to more insidious type of violence and feel that they won't be accountable, then that's when we start seeing these data points and what are other reasons on why we would have 4 times the national average, especially when we start reviewing these cases. And that's the help that we need from some of our Navajo researchers out there. We need to understand these cases and to understand what type of supportive services are needed, but also really figure out the mind of these perpetrators. Why would someone commit such a heinous crime against someone they knew or someone they were related to? And often that's what we find is it's not so much a stranger, but it's someone who has some type of familiar or family relationship with. So it's Navajo hurting Navajo. And that's a very different dynamic than we see across Indian country. And that's why it's important that we have a very Navajo specific approach on how we want to deal and support the families.
Thank you for sharing that. And I guess, in terms of resources and response, this ties into the conversation relating to law enforcement. And in that police department report I identified, they were able to identify, we have about 250 police officers to cover 27,000 square miles, essentially the size of West Virginia. And we had Chief Francisco on Sihasin Hour, and he mentioned that in order to have a timely response, he feels like he should have 750 officers, so 3 times what he has now. And the report itself identified that he needed to at least double his police force. Some of the data that you've collected through MMDR indicates that one Navajo officer is responsible for patrolling 200 square miles. The national average for the United States is 2.4 police officers for every 1,000 citizens. But on Navajo, we have less than 1 officer, 0.8 officers for every 1,000 Navajo citizens. I don't know what I'm trying to say other than there's such a need to invest in this system. There's the data component that you're talking about. Then there's also just the manpower component as well.
Jolene, I'll defer to you in a minute, but what I want to say is we always go back and forth, and when we're talking about our missing and murdered, is it a law enforcement issue? Is it a law enforcement failure? And what we have to identify is it's a systemic failure. And so when you have a systemic failure, then we have to identify what's not working now and how we need to scale up And so there's conversations on, does that mean more police officers and more boots on the ground? Or does that mean more prevention and going to peacemaking or community counseling? And so we're having these critical conversations because for every $7 you invest in prevention, for every dollar you invest in prevention, then there's studies to say that you save $7 on the criminal justice side, which is very intense to maintain, right? A police force, a detention center, a probation. And so how do we look at some of those issues? But because we're talking about such violent issues, kidnapping, murder, homicide, this is the realm where we need more law enforcement and training, and every minute matters. So when there's a missing child, every minute matters. And so we would want a law enforcement who could respond. And while we scale that up, then what can be the community response? And so we think of community training. We have alert teams who then can start the search then and there, where we're not just relying on law enforcement, but we're empowering the community because we have a responsibility and obligation to one another to find that child, but we also need training. So for missing and murdered and their relatives, and this is where I want to pivot to Jolene, is they've really have come together on this community toolkit. And so that's where we're looking at is a guide for the families to begin right when they have that sense in their gut that their relative is missing. They've either made the report or they haven't, but it's getting them those action steps that they need. So Jolene, can you tell us more about the toolkit? I know that it's not publicly available right now, but we would want to share just some insight in what we want to do and how we want to incorporate the community.
Mm-hmm. So we started the development of this community toolkit in August 2019. We collaborated with MESCI, our sister organization, Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates, and we felt that there was a need. When working with families, they had let us know that once they file the case or they're not quite sure how to file the case, the process was not clear. And understanding that there's a lack of victim advocates on the Navajo Nation, we developed this toolkit that would empower community members to mobilize in a way that's safe, but also can meet their needs. We felt like this community solution would be beneficial in that it walks families through the process of filing a missing persons case. How do they do outreach to amplify the relative who might be missing? How do they work with the criminal investigator on their case? How can they keep track of the communication log when all this important information is coming down? Also, how to mobilize for a search, which I think is really important. We have families that generally become their own advocates. They become their own search team. So we wanted to show them a way that they can still mobilize, but in a safe way. And along with that, we also realized that our MMDR task force also needs to create some sort of internal alert team. So the toolkit itself is near its completion. If folks are needing it, we can definitely work with you to start using it now, but it's more kind of in a beta form. The official launch for that is going to be November 19th. And this is going to include how you develop the profile for the person who might be missing, how to collect the information, if it's a child who is missing, or if it's an Amber Alert, what warrants an Amber Alert. If it's an elder, what kind of mental health issues might they have, or anyone who might have mental health issues. One of the more recent cases we had on Navajo was a young girl who was autistic, who was nonverbal. So we got to a point in the toolkit where we were making sure we were trying to cover all of the bases, but it's an ever evolving document. So it's not something that's going to stay the same. We were able to do some knowledge sharing with SBI, as well as a couple of other community organizations that have toolkits within their communities. And we're really excited. I think one of the next steps that we want to do with this toolkit is to develop a training. Delegate Crotty mentioned community trainings. We want to create a community cohort of folks who will be trained to provide technical assistance on the toolkit when families are in crisis. We also want to develop a training of trauma-informed care so that we are being very mindful in how we are in relationship with community and how we're in relationship with the families that we're helping. A third component to that is advocacy. In my other position with the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, we provide training to victim advocates. We provide how they can utilize effective advocacy when supporting survivors of domestic or intimate partner violence. And I think this is an opportunity to start having a conversation of what does advocacy look like for missing and murdered relatives? It's a little bit different when supporting like survivors who are experiencing violence. So how do we start asking questions and creating ways at the community level to support families and community when a relative goes missing, or even the aftercare of a relative who may have been recovered and they're okay? How do we make sure they're supported? Or if a relative is recovered and they're deceased, what's the aftercare for the family? So those are ideas that are the next steps for us. So just want to do plug. I know a lot of folks ask how they can help and help support our work. You can go to our website, be educated on the issues that are happening. And as I mentioned before, we are volunteer-based. So we do operate off of donations and anything helps. We also have resources that we provide to families in crisis. So we're able to provide some monetary support to families that might be engaged in their own search efforts. So all that to say is that this is an example of how we understand that the system has failed our Navajo relatives, understanding the lack of support from law enforcement and public safety, that this is a community solution that we should start thinking about, start talking about. And we're really excited to implement that here very soon. So a training will be made and that's going to be coming out soon. So keep an eye out for that.
Definitely. And if there's anything we can do to help promote that, we'd love to do that. And I mean, I love this because our people are so, they're so empowered. And we saw that in the response to COVID. You know, it was everyday Navajos and Hopi people stepped forward and took ownership of their communities. And they're not afraid to do that, right? And so I love what you're doing in terms of providing tools to leaders in our community, families, the people who want to do something and who will do something about it. So I want to commend you guys for putting that together. And this is so exciting to be right on the verge of your launch. Thank you for sharing that with us. One thing that I think is really neat about how you guys talk about this issue is that you're transcending political boundaries, you know, I mean, which is, I think, necessary because one thing I found really striking about the Police Department Organizational Assessment Report was the tracking of our population statistics. So it identified that in 1980, about 20% of our people lived off reservation. And as of 2010, 53% of our people lived off reservation. So there's been a massive depopulation of our nation. And so that means that this issue becomes more of an off-reservation issue. And I know there's a lot of fluidity and movement back and forth on and off the nation. But I also worry that, you know, the concentration, like who is left behind, right? Like who has not left our nation? Such a heavily service-dependent population. The report identified that very few 21 to 30-year-olds, Navajo 21 to 30-year-olds stay on the nation. But yet in the 2018 Comprehensive Economic Development Survey developed by the nation, it identified that half of our population is under the age of 30. So I mean, when you put those two together, it makes me wonder, like, is half of our population actually under the age? Like, there's this huge gap in the 20 to 30-year-olds, and then half of the population is actually younger than 20. Like, it's children and it's elders, from what I can see. Can you guys comment on that?
So I just want to comment in terms of how that takes place in the community, and you know, in the advocacy work, and who are the families that we serve. And so at times we are finding relatives who are going to more of like border towns or urban areas for economic development opportunities, and maybe have found themselves like down on their luck, or you know, doing a couch surfing in urban areas, but their children are with their parents back home. And so it's the grandparents who are trying to navigate and raise children. And so what then that creates then is, of course, this dynamic in the family support, but also then a generation of children who are relying on grandma and grandpa, Che Masane, to provide, you know, and providing shelter, but they don't really necessarily understand the dynamic of like technology, or how individuals can target families using technology. And we found that in some of our cases, like in 2019, one of our young Navajo, very young Navajo women who had just turned 18, targeted and lured by a known sexual offender, and basically kidnapped her and took her across 5 states and brutally assaulted her until she was recovered. And now that family and her case where she was missing, violently assaulted, and now trying to seek justice. And her parents had tragically, you know, dad had passed away years before, and her mom had passed away due to a family fire. And so it was the older siblings who were kind of monitoring the children. And so I think when you start looking at that family dynamic and that wave where people come and go, it destabilizes some of our family structures. There's opportunity there because you're with Masana and Che, but then they don't have the knowledge of how to protect themselves when it comes to being targeted, especially using electronics. And also we're losing all of that, what we call, you know, that's a brain drain. And so getting into the policy of things is, how can you capture those families? Because then you could have stable families here with either homes. It affects the schools. It affects the dynamics of the community wanting to get involved. Because if you're living day by day and just struggling, which a majority of our families do, you don't have the time and luxury to think about how you could train or take care of one another when you're just trying every day to take care of yourself. And so that's where nonprofits or community organizing works well, is we create the tools and the possibilities to create that safety net if, you know, populations have gone somewhere else and using all their talent and skills somewhere else. So we're missing that as a community too. So there's an impact, there's a social impact, there's an economic impact, and it also then lies into continuing with the next generation of destabilized families.
I think another part to that too is, you know, our people and our relatives feeling safe. Like, what is a safe community where they're able to have lives where they're thriving and raising their families here? And it's very true, the destabilization that comes from these different forms of traumas that happen in our communities. We also know that it's also socioeconomic and things like that. So I think that's one thing that we've asked, I think, when we do our planning too, about like healing conversations. What does a safe community look like? And I think this was an idea for a virtual forum that we wanted to have, where community leads that conversation. Like, what do you envision a safe community in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? What do people need to feel supported? But also, like, an example when I say supported, and I know, like, you know, the stigma of like tribal workers, you know, like people, they kind of get a bad rap, right? And there was someone had posted, what can we do to make customer service better? And folks, you know, had thought about, oh, they need training, they need attitude adjustments, things like that. And it's like, well, not really. If you take a step back, in any way, like any part of your life, if you're feeling good, if you're feeling supported, you show up. And so just throwing it out there saying, well, is the Navajo Nation taking care of their employees? Are they getting the proper time off? Do they have wages that are supporting their way of life, where they have access to efficient healthcare? Do they have access to, like when I lived out there, my gas bill was over $400 during the winter. Can you imagine a family whose mom is making $9 an hour as a receptionist? That is a very significant chunk of their paycheck. So I think we also need to be having conversations on how we are making community feel supported. How is our, I guess the powers that be are shifting that way of thinking. And back to that example is, I think if employees were getting that proper time off, feeling supported, getting the coaching that they need, and feeling taken care of, they're going to show up for community in like so many like great ways. And that's just an example. And I don't know how many people laughed at my response, but I'm like a firm believer that it really is about reconnecting the relationships that we have with one another through kinship, through our cultural values. And I know those are like larger conversations, but there are ones that we can certainly have with our families now, that we can certainly have among friends. How do we reconnect that and support?
Thanks. So Ethel, what I wanted, Shade, was, and what you may not know and what's important to this conversation that we're having here, and I appreciate the time, Navajo Nation does not have a missing persons unit. We're years into the promise to the families back in 2018 for a missing persons unit. That's still something that we're asking for. We've had to put it in the Navajo Nation budget as a condition of appropriation for public safety to develop one. And so they have until March of next year to develop and implement and bring it back to council, or else we're going to sanction some of their funding for their division director. We're also looking at how to include like the E911 system. We're also saying what victim services are here on Navajo. And right now, in having a conversation, there are no victim services for our missing families here on Navajo, none. And so we have to work with our providers. And so those are actions that in this day and age, the type of media attention, the type we really need our Navajo Nation programs to develop and incorporate those services, or as we've been moving forward as a council, then designating other individuals to provide victim services. So Navajo Utah Health System is going to help the nation with the Office of Victims of Grant, and we're going to be able to provide, for the first time ever, services to families. And we're still looking for victim advocates who can support families like Ella Mae Begay. I mean, talking with the family and just them wanting the human dignity to be updated. Those are things that the nation should be providing, and we're not. And so a lot of people think that MMDR is a Navajo Nation program, and we're not. I'm a delegate. We work with the Office of the Speaker, we work with other delegates, and we work with other volunteers. So I think that's important to know as we end this conversation. And if you wanted to reach out or provide any guidance, we appreciate the work that you did as our Attorney General, and really pivot and to have these hard, and to start having these hard conversations. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And you know, part of our strategic plan with Ye Ha'oni, though, is really to bolster the psychological, mental, and emotional health of our community. And part of why that's the case is because, you know, having had that experience as AG and having led public safety summits, and really honed in on the modern day monsters of violence, suicide, and substance misuse, you know, it's like, these are all different ways to kill yourself. And so our people are killing themselves at a very high rate in terms of like who is on the nation. And it's because, you know, it's the survival situation. Like there's limited resources, and the intensity of the stress, like what Jolene was mentioning, that our employees go through, even just trying to support their families. But, you know, it's sort of like, well, we don't necessarily want to be involved in service provision, but just reminding our people, like, your life matters, you know? And so you need to protect that, and reminding them that they're survivors, you know, and they're the fittest of our population. You know, our people who were smart enough to survive and strong enough to survive, like they're descendants of those people, and they have value, and they have an obligation to their ancestors, to their lives, and to live beautiful lives, right? But yeah, absolutely. Like if there's some way we can help, and I'm happy to share any knowledge that I have. But we are wrapping up our session. And if you would each like to offer some final thoughts, I would love to continue talking for another 30 minutes, but I know you guys are extremely busy, and I thank you so very much for being willing to have this conversation today. But yes, if you could share with us some parting thoughts.
The only in part, I will let Amber close it out, but mine is just more around if you're wanting to get involved. We do have our strategic planning meeting this coming Friday. If you would like to get involved with the work that we're doing, you can send an email to navajommdr@gmail.com. We do meet every second and fourth Friday of every month, which is our regular meeting times. And you can reach out in that way. So just want to leave some information there.
Thank you, Jolene. And Jolene is like our core, our rock, and keeps us like grounded logistically. What I want to say as an endpoint is the work continues. We still do not have data on our LGBTQI community and relatives, and we want to also scale up our efforts in identifying, you know, our disabled and handicapped communities. They're disproportionately affected by violence, and yet, you know, the system continues to silence them. So those are some areas, and we're always, like, if you are interning, if you know a college student, we have had interns. We've worked with Northern Arizona University. We worked with Arizona State University, Diné College. We had a student last semester from Fort Lewis College. And so if you're out there, you want to do something, intern with us, and you can get credits to directly help your people. And we need you here, and your life does matter. So Sihasin for the time and the energy.
Wonderful. Well, to both of you, and have a beautiful day. And wow, you guys are just phenomenal. And it, you know, the point that MMDR is all volunteer, I mean, it shouldn't be. It really should not be. And so, you know, please post your link for how folks can donate to support your work. And if there's anything we can do, I mean, we had a public safety system fund almost established. It made it all the way through to council vote. That was $58 million that could have infused this system with a surge of resources, officers, victim advocates, prosecutors, public defenders. We were so close. And I really wish that incoming funds could be dedicated from a settlement or something, could be dedicated to tackling this issue. Well,
let's do it. Let's work together. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, have a beautiful day.
Okay, we'll see you. I'm going to drink that Navajo tea and honey. We'll talk soon. I'm going to.
Oh yeah, go on.